Have you ever noticed that things are changing? I'm not talking about in the realm of politics, in the realms of economics, in the realms of everyday life, as in who's in our lives and who's not in our lives. I'm not talking about technology, and boy, hasn't technology changed over the years. Do you remember a time when there was no internet? There was no GPS? Oh, times have changed. But let me ask you this. Have you noticed that things are changing? Thank you so much for joining me today on Walking with the Word. I hope that as we're together, we'll study and we'll learn there's something great for us in this life. What I want us to study today is the great moral decline, looking at society and Christian behavior. The truth is, as we look at our society, we are witnessing an unmistakable shift in society norms and behaviors. I hope that we see that shift start to correct, but what we're seeing is some self-centered ideologies, a culture that glorifies self-expression without boundaries and often at the expense of truth and humility. We have a breakdown of the family unit, rising divorce rates not only in our country but around the world, absent parenting, and the redefining of the family structure. We have in our society a desensitization of those things that are wrong. This happens through media, through education, through acts that once were deemed as shameful and immoral, now normalized or even celebrated. We have a world that's filled with aggression and hostility, whether we're talking about school violence, political discourse, or self-harm problems that exist in our society. We have a loss or a lack of reverence for God, even among church circles, those who claim to be Christians. We are losing our ability to be reverent toward God. You see, what I'm telling you is, as we live in our lives today, we are recognizing a great moral decline. So what do we do about that? How do we address that problem, and how should we think about it? Well, I want to give you three things. I want to give you a biblical warning. We'll see two passages written by Paul, see some cultural examples, and then see a biblical response. Let's start by seeing that biblical warning, and to do so, take your Bibles, go to 2 Timothy, and let's notice chapter 3 and chapter 4. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at verse 1 all the way through verse 4 in both of those segments as we begin. We read in 2 Timothy 3, picking up in verse 1, "But I know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Whew, Paul, you're writing a letter to Timothy and you're telling us in the last days, in the last times that man will live, that there are going to be great problems. Now, as you study the writings of Paul, you may ask a couple of questions, and one may be this: what day was Paul referring to as he's writing these things? But I know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. When are these days? Well, as you read the New Testament, you will see, as you go from the Old to the New Testament, the time of which Christ lived. And you will see all of the problems that existed in the world when Christ was not only a child, but also in His ministry. And you will see those problems continue to grow stronger and stronger and stronger. And you will see all of these things that Paul has listed culminate in these times that we're reading about. These were things happening in the days of Paul. These are things happening in the days of you and me. The real question becomes, what do we do about it? We're looking at the great moral decline, looking at society and a Christian's response. Well, what do we do about problems of morality? Well, we've got to have not only a biblical warning, but a biblical response. When you move from 2 Timothy 3 into 2 Timothy 4, you see what Paul says to young Timothy. Here's how you handle these issues. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned unto fables. What was Paul trying to tell Timothy? There's going to come a time when people are going to stop listening. Now that would have happened in the days of Timothy because these are warnings for Timothy. Paul writing to Timothy directly. But we look at our society and see the same things that exist, and we understand the answer is in God's Word. But let's look at the second place, and let's look at some cultural examples, and let's just try to see why these things are so evil. Number one, when we look at our culture, we learn that our culture has become lovers of themselves. Maybe even those in the church have this problem. Narcissism, which is excessive sense of self-importance. An excessive self-promotion on social media, and the primary goal of personal happiness. Let me ask you this. Do we see in our society people who love themselves? You know, sometimes we fall into that category, and we need to work to restrain ourselves from those things, to not become the most important person in the room, to not become the person who only promotes themselves, but to be a person who loves others. You see, when there is one, there is the other. When there are lovers of themselves, there needs to be lovers of others. You see, our world says love yourself. Jesus says love and serve others. When we look at cultural examples, we see disobedience being really, probably, maybe one of our society's greatest problems. Now, specifically, we're talking about disobedience to parents. A youth rebellion is normalized in media. There is a lack of discipline, and there is a declining respect for elders. Here's the truth. There is a difference between abuse and discipline. And our society has run our minds to one side of the spectrum, saying all discipline is abuse. Well, that's not true. That's not true at all. But what we do see is we see people who, well, they at a very young age want to follow self. Are we starting to see one of the problems that come with a great moral decline? Self, self, self. We have people who are disobedient to parents. We need to have people on the other side of the coin who love and obey their parents. That's a cultural change. We have slanderers that exist in that side of society. There's online bullying that exists. There is cancel culture, and there is character assassination. Now, don't hear me wrong. There are things in society that are wrong and should not be. But we live in a time where everybody online has a voice. Everybody online has a keyboard. I like to call them keyboard warriors. Everybody in the world wants to have an opinion. And you know whose opinion is always right? Well, it's not yours and mine. At least that's what they'll tell us. And maybe even to ourselves, we'll say it's not theirs, it's mine. But this idea of slanderers are those who take things that are not true and they report them as if they are fact, and thus cancel culture and character assassination deal with slander. We need to have the opposite of that. We need truth tellers, encouragers, and not slanderers. We have lovers of pleasure. You see, all of these, slanderers, lovers of pleasure, they have to do with self. We have a generation that prioritizes entertainment, sexual gratification, and leisure over holiness and worship. You see, once again, we found the center of these problems. It's all about me. It's all about I. We have a self problem that is culminating in a moral decline. The Bible warned of such things in various generations. The same is true today. Culture shows us this is happening. So how do we respond? That's the third point for us today. What is the biblical response? Well, number one, I want you to see two categories. They come in Galatians 5. They start in verse 19, and they begin again anew in verse 22. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are. And then he gives a list of things that are fleshly, worldly, sensual. But the fruit of the Spirit is. And then he gives a list of things that bring us closer to God. How do we fix a moral decline? Well, number one, before we ever address our world, as a Christian, become a person who produces fruit. Become a person who produces fruit. Destroy those works that are in your life, those things that are, he says, evident. They're works of the world, they're works of the flesh. Let me tell you what they really are. They're works of the devil. And Jesus called the devil a liar and the father of it. And we need to work these things in our lives so that we are who we are supposed to be. That needs to be the biblical response, number one. We need to be who we're supposed to be. Well, you may be saying, well, how do I do that in a world that tells me everything that's right is wrong and everything that's wrong is right? Well, listen to what Paul wrote to the Romans in Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you, I beg you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies, notice this, a living sacrifice, holy, set apart, acceptable to God by His will, which is your reasonable service. Now, pay attention now. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We've got to get the mind right. Our world is filled with all sorts of things, and don't get me wrong, some of the things our world does is amazing. But don't miss this. Sometimes our world just misses it. We need to get the mind right so that we can transform our lives right so that we can be His before we ever look at our world. And then the principle that comes at play. It's a childhood passage, and what I mean by this is many times people see it and they go, oh, I've heard that before. Oh, I remember that as a child. Oh, I remember the little song that talks about this. Listen to this passage. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? Isn't good for nothing to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden. Oh, we put that little lampstand out and we don't hide it under a bushel. Remember that children's song? You are the salt. You are the light. Where? Of the earth. What's the biblical response to a world that's in moral decline? Live righteously. So how do we do that? Well, 1 Peter 2:21 tells you and tells me how to do that. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in His steps. Follow in His steps. The question I need to ask you, and And I need to ask me is, do I really know my Lord? Do I really know Jesus? Not just in a historical account, not just in a public figure record, but do you know how Jesus treated others? Do you know how Jesus helped others? Do you know Jesus? You see, in a world that's filled with moral decline, we have a biblical warning. Things are going to change through generations. We have cultural examples and a biblical response, but the question becomes, what will we do tomorrow? What will we do tomorrow with this information? And that's where life gets hard. When you talk about the great moral decline, society, and Christian behavior, what we have to do is we have to make it real to our lives. And in doing that, we walk with the Word every day of our lives.